Today I'm going to be speaking about my history with depression. This is a trigger warning about any type of mental health or abuse as well before we get started. So I'm going to be going through this chronologically. When I was born, I already had the genes turned on in me that experienced depression due to the environment I was born in. Then up until the age of 4, I went through sexual abuse. And with this particular caregiver, they also programmed DID, dissociative identity disorder, within me, with two alters in particular. One of them was programmed to have depression and to be suicidal. So when I was 4, I didn't remember any of this. One of the other alters basically locked away the memory. So I had no idea why I was sad, and I had no recollection of what happened basically up into the age of 4 regarding this abuse. When I was in preschool, I remember during recess I would sit behind a corner on this bench where most people didn't go, and I would cry and cry and cry. I would sing to myself too as a kind of soothing way. I didn't have any language for what I was going through. I realize now I was feeling hopeless, depressed, isolated, scared, lonely, and I was feeling suicidal. No one really understood what was going on with me, and it seemed that people around me would be upset if I was crying, and I didn't want to upset people or cause conflict. So, as a people pleaser, I just stopped showing people that I was sad. I stopped crying around people and only cried when I was by myself. And this crying, which I mostly did when I was alone, like at night, I cried every night for my entire life like this up until something changed when I was 17. So I really identified myself as just being very quiet and very shy. I didn't know what depression was. I had no knowledge, education, or vocabulary for what was going on. In school, I didn't really form close friendships with people. Again, I just thought I was very shy, um, and didn't realize what I was going through. Because after the age of 4, while the sexual abuse did stop, the same caregiver did very intentional psychological torture past that age. Um, so that continued, and it's different than unintentional, like psychological or emotional abuse, where someone doesn't really have a plan or doesn't really know what they're doing. They may yell or put someone down. However, what was happening here with this type of psychological torture, it was very intentional, kind of almost like a chess game where they could see all the moves in front of them, any move I could make, and it was a game for them. Very, very intentional, very strategical, very slow, very planned out, intended to hurt me, very purposefully. So um, I did form a group of friends by the age of, well, I did form like a loose group of friends, but I didn't really share anything about myself. And what was going on too with this psychological torture is that I never, hardly ever stood up for myself. I basically didn't want this person to get to me. So when this abuse was occurring, I felt kind of very outer body. And I felt almost like I was in my own chessboard, like above my head, where instead of even playing, I took myself off the board and just didn't react to the best of my ability. I was crying silently, but never loudly, and I never argued back, basically. the only two times I ever stood up for myself, the only two situations were, one, to ensure that basically this sexual abuse didn't continue on with anyone else. Um, and so I just made sure I was in a particular place during particular times to make sure that didn't happen to anyone else I loved. Although I didn't remember what had happened, I had no idea why I was so passionate about not letting this environment occur. And the only other thing I stood up for was my activities. So what happened is that I used to be in a lot of activities as a kid, and slowly, one by one, this person took them all away. I stopped doing acting, I stopped doing singing, I stopped being in the bell choir, I stopped doing confirmation at church, I stopped doing gymnastics. There's probably some others too, and the last big one was I stopped playing soccer at 5th grade, and the only thing I had left, because basically they're forcing me to choose one. Yeah, I stopped swimming. Was ballet. Ballet is what I chose, and that's the only thing, like past the age of 12, that I ever argued back on. And it was a struggle. I even got taken out of dance sometimes. And that's the only thing I would ever fight back on. So when I was in 5th grade, and I had this group of friends where I didn't really say much, but it felt very uncomfortable, and I felt very ostracized if I was sitting alone or doing recess alone. I realized it just wasn't safe didn't feel safe to be alone because I would just want to cry. So I would rather just try to do what other people were doing and go along with the group. Even though I didn't really feel much connection, I hardly, if ever, hung out with anyone outside of school besides for maybe birthdays. And when I was in 5th grade, well, one of the main ways of this psychological torture from this caregiver was to convince me that I was lying. So after our conversations, I would go off by myself, and because I knew what was happening since the age of 4 regarding the psychological torture, I was aware what was going on. And so I would reprogram my mind to make sure I knew what was the truth and what wasn't, because it would be incredibly confusing when I was talking to this person. And basically, it got really bad in 5th grade where I actually believed one of these lies, past the point of this conversation. There was a play. They were doing the play Annie at my school, and we needed a signature, basically, to be able to be in this play. And this person was one of the people to sign off on it. And they signed the paper, and I turned the paper in. And when I talked to this person again, it was probably about after school rehearsals. They told me that they never signed the paper and that I forged their signature. I did not, but I actually came to believe that is what happened, to the extent that I wrote an apology letter to the music teacher, and she knew what was going on. She had experience with kids going through this type of trauma, and it got resolved. It was very heartbreaking. And I was in the play, and I played Molly, who was the sad girl, and it was kind of nice because I felt like I could finally be sad without being judged for it. But what happened is that I never cried at school past the age of preschool up until this point. But when this was going on, and I didn't know I was going to be in the play yet, I basically cried in front of my friends, and they asked me why, and so I started telling stories about what would happen with this caregiver, and I never really had anything to say in conversation before other than just listening and saying the same thing they were saying. So basically what happened after that, I don't know, maybe for weeks or something, is they would want to hear stories about what happened with this caregiver, and I'm like, wow, I have things to say. I feel connected. I don't feel as lonely. And then one day, this group of friends did come over, um, and was around this caregiver for the first time. And after that, they told me I was lying about all these stories. I hadn't considered this before, but as I mentioned, with this form of intentional psychological torture, they know how to play you, basically. And I had never thought about how this person is extremely charismatic, extremely is intentional in how they speak. And so my friends at the time thought I was lying because I guess they didn't think a person who presented themselves like that was capable of what I was explaining. So they weren't my friends after that for a little bit of time, maybe a week or so. And then they said they accepted me back in their friend group and they forgave me for lying. I don't think they ever believed me. And I just wanted things to go back to usual so I wasn't alone during lunch or recess again. And so I learned to just not talk about my trauma. I learned to not talk about what was happening. And I didn't open up about it again. And I felt even more lonely and disconnected. For various reasons, this friendship group fell apart in 7th grade. Like, by that time, people moved away. We had falling outs. And at this time, I was befriended by someone else. And this person kind of acted like a therapist for me. They wanted to hear all my problems. They believed me on all my problems. However, I felt like this odd power dynamic. Like, I felt more like a patient of theirs than a peer. And so in that way, this friendship was unfulfilling for me. Everything basically just stayed the same in terms of my depression. And in terms of my like loneliness and isolation, I did form another, like, just people again I would sit with at lunch, and I would be with, so I wasn't alone. But besides for this one person, I didn't open up about what I was going through. And again, I still didn't have any language in terms of mental health for what I was going through. So when I was 17, I realized that in a year I'd be 18. And I knew things with court were complicated. And I knew that when I was 18, no one would, have custody of me, basically. And so when I was 17, I had like my first ever really like panic attack. It was in the middle of school, it was during lunch, and I just knew in my bones that I could not go back and see this caregiver again. I just felt like not an option. And so I didn't. It was very dramatic and a lot happened, but I did not see this caregiver again. And This was one of the hardest times up until this point for me, because I thought my sadness was because of this person. I thought that if I left this person, then I wouldn't cry anymore every day. I wouldn't be sad. But I was still sad. It was still with me. And I was just devastated. I thought it would fix how I felt. And it didn't. So when I was 17, during the time of summer, I found a lot of information about depression for the first time on social media, like on Tumblr. And this is when I realized I was depressed. I also realized I had anxiety and PTSD at this time too. Unfortunately, what I was looking at was very much romanticizing depression, and I learned about self-harm and suicidality at this time too. And so I realized this was what was happening, and it was so painful because before, while it hurt, I didn't know what was going on. And it felt like something I could put an end to. I just thought I was a shy, quiet person, how it presented in me. But now that I knew I had depression, it felt like something was wrong with me. Just like on a very base core, something was wrong with me. And it was just devastating. Up until this point, as I mentioned, I never wanted to be living, although I didn't have the words for that. Instead, I was just trying to not cause any conflict. And for the most part, the path of least resistance is just to do K through 12 schooling. I didn't really have a plan after that. And school felt very important to me in terms of I felt like a worthy person who mattered because I got really good grades. And when I was 18 and I was about to graduate high school, I was in my last semester. I don't really know exactly what happened, but I stopped going to school for 2 weeks. It was like I didn't have a plan for afterwards. I felt like a wrong and broken person. I didn't want to be here. And it felt like if I passed this finish line, then it would be like consenting to continue to live when I didn't want to do that. So for these 2 weeks, I stopped eating, I stopped going to school, I didn't really get out of bed, and I had never been like that before because I was just trying to please everyone around me. So I would be sad at night. I'd be sad all the time and not show it, but it never affected how I was acting. Like in terms of motivation, I suppose. But now I had no motivation. I did go back to school and I graduated with C's. And after that, I just felt nothing. I stopped crying, which I hadn't done, since the age of 4. I stopped crying every day. I stopped smiling. A lot was going on with my eating as well, and I think I want to cover eating disorders in another video. But basically, I stopped moving, I stopped interacting with people. I really just laid in bed and watched YouTube all day. And I lost like 15 pounds of muscle that I had gained from doing ballet. And I was just really weak. Things stayed like this for about 1.5 years until I was 19. At this time, I started dating people. And I dated people for the next 5 years of my life until I was 24. I didn't want to live, and I hated myself. I hated the pain that I was in. I also dealt with physical pain, and I hated my thoughts. I hated my intrusive thoughts. I hated my life, and I didn't want to be living. When I was in these relationships with other people, I didn't care about myself. I wasn't taking care of myself. I was more just experiencing life to experience it. Really high highs, really low lows. I didn't care what happened to me. And unfortunately, I harmed other people as well with this lack of regard for myself. When I was 21, I remembered the sexual assault and abuse that happened with me up until the age of 4. And the altar that was programmed to have depression and be suicidal, this often happens when people are intentionally programmed, where it's, if they ever remember the trauma, they're supposed to end their life. So this was a really hard time for me because of that. My relationships ended at 24 when I had an autistic burnout. And an autistic burnout is similar to a traumatic brain injury in terms of, for months afterwards, I wasn't able to take care of myself. Everything regressed. I'd been living independently and I couldn't do that anymore. I didn't know how to feed myself. I didn't know how to shower. I didn't know how to clean. Even driving was different. And all my senses were heightened. All my sensory issues were heightened. At this time, I didn't know that I had autism. After I stopped dating people when I was 25, about 6 months after this autistic burnout, I discovered a lot about myself. I discovered that I had autism, that I had ADHD. I discovered that I had DID. I discovered that I had chronic pain, hypermobile Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, and POTS. And I discovered that I had various other types of dissociation. It was really painful because just like when things were illuminated to me with depression, anxiety, and PTSD at 17, I felt really sad now that I knew, again in my mind, what was wrong with me. And now it's like I had to look at things more clearly. And I didn't want to, because things had always gotten worse with my mental and physical health. I really tried to numb myself with social media and just scrolling, just not having any moments of peace or quiet. I also was smoking weed, which was really helping with the chronic pain and with my insomnia, which I'll talk about insomnia in a different video. But for me, weed was also just really dulling everything, so I didn't have to think about what I now knew, the issues that I now knew I was aware that I had, especially DID, because you're never supposed to figure out that you have it. It's a way where your brain is trying to protect itself. So things stayed like this from the age of 25 until the age of 27, where I was just numb and dull, and I didn't want to feel anything. I just was trying to get through life. And I still didn't want to be here. When I was 27, I had a spiritual awakening. I've talked about this in other videos and want to do a video only on my spiritual awakening in the future. I had an injury that almost ended my life. And this is what triggered this awakening. And for 3 weeks, I had no depression, no anxiety, no flashbacks, no dissociation, no chronic pain. And all of these things I was either born with or greatly increased and solidified by the age of 4, and then like again at 17, and throughout my life just kept getting worse. I had never known what it felt like not to be depressed. It was like I could breathe for the first time. I also had visual snow, and it was gone. I could see clearly, literally see for the first time. It was incredible. It ended after 3 weeks. And everything came crashing back down. Just how it was before. But just like when I was 17, and just like when I was 25, I could see things clearer now. Because of the contrast from what it feels like not to be depressed to what it feels like to be depressed, which I'd never experienced before. I knew and could see in its fullness all the pain that I was going through. And it was unbearable to have this knowledge. For about 4 months after this, I just stayed in this state of so much pain and suffering. But I had hope. I knew that how I felt for those 3 weeks was possible. Where before everything had always gotten worse, and I assumed it always would get worse. In October of 2024, 4 months after this, I really started diving into spirituality more. And with this, I started setting intentions. Intentions to heal, to not have anxiety, to not have depression. And throughout this next, 6 months or so, I started doing shadow work, and I had never done that before. Where I was really looking at the root of the problems and how that made me feel. I started journaling as my separate altars, which I didn't know existed before. I didn't know how they felt individually. I started journaling about everything and working through everything. And in the spring of 2025, this is when I'm 28 now. In the spring, I started listening to all my intrusive thoughts. And one of them did come from the altar that has depression and suicidality. I want to make a whole nother video dedicated to this experience of this time with my intrusive thoughts. Basically what happened is that I had never fully listened to them before. It was like they were static in the back of my mind always. And if I listened to them, then I hated myself for that thought, and it would just kind of stay back here. So what I did was intentionally listen to every single thought, clearer and louder, and I accepted them, and I loved them, and I was basically reparenting myself. This was an extremely difficult process. It lasted for about 2 months. And then it went away. All the thoughts went away. And I didn't have thoughts of depression anymore. I didn't feel hopeless. I didn't have a lack of motivation. I really wanted to live here. And that stayed with me ever since. Everyone experiences sadness. And I have times where I am sad. And I love it. And I accept it and pass it through my body. And I no longer am having bouts of depression. It's now the start of 2026. I'm still 28. And for now, that's where my story ends. I don't have depression anymore. And it's something I thought I was going to struggle with and suffer with my entire life. There's been a lot of really difficult parts of this journey. And I'm really grateful for where I am now and where I'm headed. I hope my story helps some people feel less alone, more understood, gave other people some hope. And I really look forward to making more videos in depth about the process that I've had specifically in this last 1.5 years of healing my depression, something I thought wasn't really possible for me. I look forward to making more videos about my mental health. I did one overarching one chronologically of all my mental and physical health issues. I did one on gender and sexuality related to mental health. I did one on my chronic pain, and I did one on anxiety. And I plan to do more on my other specific mental and physical health issues and situations I've gone through. Along with other things like the specific spirituality situations that have helped healed my mental and physical health, and I don't have any of those issues anymore. It's all gone, and it's extremely magical, and I'm so grateful. I'm really excited to continue sharing my story about what happened and how I got here.